On July 16th of 1945, at the Alamogordo bombing range in New Mexico, the first successful detonation of an atomic weapon occurred. The development of this weapon was an ongoing process undertaken by some of the brightest minds of the country, known as the Manhattan Project. Thus began a new age, a race for nuclear weaponry, tested and ready for war. At the forefront of this frantic scramble was Julius Robert Oppenheimer. Born April 22, 1904 in New York City, Oppenheimer was a brilliant man, but he was a scientist, not a politician. It was his loyalty to fact, not war, that was his political and mental downfall. From a young age, Oppenheimer seemed destined for a career in science. When he was 11, Oppenheimer joined the New York Mineralogical Club, the youngest to ever do so. It was here that he made his scientific debut when he was asked to give a lecture to the club at the age of 12. He went on to graduate from the New York School for Ethical Culture, at which time he could speak 5 languages and had developed a passion for the liberal arts. It should be noted that Oppenheimer had a very isolated school career. He once commented to his English teacher, quote, "I'm the loneliest man in the world." He was snatched up by Harvard University, but was unsure of what his major would be. After a recommendation from a friend, he decided on chemistry. In his junior year, though, Oppenheimer stumbled upon physics, and he immediately fell in love. Because of his rigorous studies, Oppenheimer graduated in only 3 years. Soon after, he left for the scientific powerhouse that was Europe. Despite his degree in chemistry, he was accepted into the Cavendish Experimental Physics Lab at Cambridge University, headed by Ernest Rutherford. He was then assigned to work under J.J. Thomson, the physicist who had discovered the electron. Despite having achieved everything he had wanted, he was overworked and was driven to the edge of a mental breakdown. As a last resort, he sought out a psychiatrist. He was diagnosed with dementia praecox, a type of schizophrenia literally meaning early insanity. Many thought it was his, quote, baroque tendency to exaggerate, but his colleagues and professors felt that it was more than that. Whether or not the diagnosis was correct, Oppenheimer refused to accept the limitations it would present. He left England and headed to Germany. Here, he took a position at the University of Göttingen. During a time of scientific upheaval and revolutionary physics, Oppenheimer rose to fame. His unquenchable thirst for knowledge and easy grasp of physics quickly established him as the brightest mind on campus. He received his doctorate in physics and returned to the United States, determined to start the quantum revolution there as well. Upon returning to the States and while teaching at Berkeley, Oppenheimer met Jean Tatlock. They began dating and were passionately in love, almost married on 2 separate occasions. This relationship, happy as it was, would come back to bite Oppenheimer. Tatlock was a member of the Communist Party of America and shared with Oppenheimer her political views. In a letter to Kenneth D. Nichols, manager of the Atomic Energy Commission, Oppenheimer described some aspects of their political relationship. Quote, "She told me about her Communist Party memberships. They were on-again, off-again affairs and never seemed to provide for her what she was seeking. I do not believe that her interests were really political. She loved this country and its people and its life. She was, as it turned out, a friend of many fellow travelers and communists, with a number of whom I was later to become acquainted." End quote. The road to creating a successful atomic bomb was a long and grueling one. When it was discovered that Germany was researching atomic energy, the U.S. government put together a dream team of scientists, heeding the advice of Albert Einstein. In 1942, command of the still-hatching project was handed over to Brigadier General Leslie Groves, who officially codenamed the initiative the Manhattan Engineer District, more commonly known as the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer was not brought onto the team until later in its development. Early talks were comprised of the elite few and were highly confidential. Since 1932, Oppenheimer had been doing research and experimentation of his own on the topics of greatest interest of those in the Manhattan Project, but he was unaware of the political weight they carried. Nevertheless, Oppenheimer was eager to become engaged in the war effort. He got his chance in 1941 when Ernest Lawrence invited Oppenheimer to one of the earliest meetings of the country's best and brightest, in which they would discuss their overarching plan for proceeding with the construction of nuclear weapons. He was encouraged by friends to cut ties with radical organizations he had joined or affiliated with during his relationship with Tatlock, as the government was very obviously displeased about a possible communist being inducted into the most important and secretive undergoing of its time. Oppenheimer did cut ties and soon after was recruited into the Manhattan Project's inner circles and placed in charge of the theoretical physics department, which had the responsibility of designing the weapon itself. The project was largely compartmentalized under the order of Groves. Labs were hidden around the country, and no lab knew where the others were or what they were doing. Oppenheimer, who had greatly impressed the Brigadier General, was allowed to choose the location of his team and his lab. The place he chose was Los Alamos, New Mexico. The barren mesa was perfect for testing atomic weaponry. Construction soon began, and not long after deciding on the location, an old scout camp had been renovated and turned into one of the most revolutionary laboratories of its time. Oppenheimer traveled the country visiting old students and colleagues, trying to convince them to work on the project. Many of those who joined up were refugees from war-torn Europe. They knew how devastating and unbeatable Germany would become if they acquired nuclear capabilities. Some of the world's most famous physicists, Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, and many more, came in droves. By the end of the war, there were over 6,500 people living at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer had planned on 30. Oppenheimer's main focus was perhaps more stressful than splitting atoms or inducing fission. He was in charge of mediation. As the past and present continue to tell us, the military and science divisions don't mix well. Oppenheimer took it upon himself to keep the government and military patient, as well as keeping the scientists motivated and reminding them of their goal. Many from the site christened Oppenheimer the father of the atomic bomb. Without him, they said, the atomic bomb would never have become a reality. After 3 years of unflagging research, work, and construction, the bomb was completed. But Oppenheimer signed up for the race to develop the bomb before Nazi Germany, not for the massacre of thousands of innocent Japanese people. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer took a very controversial stance. He proclaimed stark opposition of the development of the hydrogen bomb. This was his downfall. At this time, America was deep in the hold of the Red Scare. Fear of communism and left-wingism was abundant, and Julius Oppenheimer felt the brunt of it. The beginning of Oppenheimer's demise was named Louis Lichtenstein Strauss. Strauss had always been a huge proponent of the hydrogen bomb and had had a personal vendetta against Oppenheimer. This was his chance. After years of spying, he had a way to dethrone Oppenheimer and make way for the manufacturing of weapons of mass destruction. Because Oppenheimer didn't want to slaughter thousands more innocent people, he was labeled a communist. In 1953, he was asked to resign from his position as advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission. His refusal made him subject to a hearing that wasn't entirely legal. Charges against him were issues that had been resolved in past years. Since it wasn't a court of law, unfounded or insubstantial evidence was allowed. Oppenheimer's defense didn't have access to the prosecution's case. In the end, Oppenheimer lost his security clearance, but he lost much more than that. He lost his dignity and any respect or credibility he had had in the scientific community. Oppenheimer was brilliant, a genius, and his talents were wasted because of McCarthyism and a growing paranoia of communist threat in America. Friends and coworkers urged him to take up one of the many offers to work for universities and institutions outside the country, but he refused, because even after what was done to him, he said with tears in his eyes, "Damn it, I happen to love this country." Often we tend to think of someone's legacy as something good or positive that they inspired, something that changed or continues to change the world. Oppenheimer's legacy certainly changed the world, but few would call it positive. His legacy was the loss of almost 200,000 lives in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His legacy was a 45-year-long stalemate between the United States and the Soviet Union, because despite the good intentions of a man, he has no control over his successors. Though he left unintentional destruction in his wake, Oppenheimer did leave us with things that made this world better. Due to him, energy is getting cleaner. Nuclear plants emit very little carbon dioxide and offer an alternative to the burning of coal and natural gas. And possibly, Hiroshima brought something good. After seeing the true destruction of the atomic bomb, the rest of the world has been scared straight. Scared enough that to this day, there has not been another drop of a nuclear weapon in war since. Even though the invention of nuclear weaponry in part brought the Cold War to its peak, it also kept it from getting out of hand. Both the US and the Soviet Union had the capabilities to start a nuclear war, but neither did. 45 years of pointed guns and no one pulled any triggers. Why? Because they were scared. They were scared of the smoking craters that were once Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the end, it was destruction and terror that kept the participants of the Cold War from starting World War III. Oppenheimer was an extremely influential person in American contemporary history. His leadership and contributions in the Manhattan Project have changed our world. His work led to almost unfathomable destruction and immortalized Hiroshima and Nagasaki as grim reminders of the awesome power of atomic energy. The scientific world continues to create better uses and enhance understanding of nuclear energy. Though the race for nuclear capabilities Oppenheimer inspired brought the Cold War to its peak, the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki kept things from getting irreversibly out of hand and continue to do so. In every great man's legacy, there always seems to be a bit of sorrow.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.